Let me shift gears and introduce our next topic, the emergence of new power, a way to use the new media and technology to shift the power from the hands of just a few people to the hands of many. Jeremy Heimans is co-founder and CEO of Purpose, a home for building 21st century movement and venture that use the power of participation to change the world. Jeremy has been building movements since the age of 8, when as a child activist in his native Australia, he ran media campaigns and lobbied leaders on issues like children's rights and nuclear non-proliferation. Since its start in 2009, Purpose has launched several major new organizations with huge impact on social issues. Jeremy, I leave you the podium.
Hello, everybody. It's terrific to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here in a room full of stylish Italians. When I'm in Europe, I consider the highest compliment when someone asks me whether I'm Italian. So I want to talk to you today about how power is shifting in the world. And to give you a framework that I've developed recently with Henry Timms that will be published this fall in the Harvard Business Review, that tries to unpack those shifts, the sort of disruptions that we see in politics, the crisis of representation and governance that we face, and certainly the shifts in the economy, and move beyond a simplistic analysis that just explains all of those shifts in terms of technology, which is often what happens. So I'm going to sort of build that picture out, but I want to start by talking to you about a man called Anna Hazare. So Anna Hazare is not the person that you would associate ostensibly with what you might call new power. He is an Indian Gandhian anti-corruption activist who uses very traditional techniques like hunger strikes in order to pursue his activism. But a few years ago, he began to experiment with new ways to engage people. And initially, he asked people to send a text message if they supported his national campaign against corruption. And he put this call out, and he got a good response, about 70,000 people. But then he slightly shifted his tactics. He asked people to leave him a missed call. Now, for those of you who spent time in the Global South, you might know that a big part of mobile phone culture in the Global South is that in order to avoid phone charges, people leave each other missed calls. So if you're running late, as I know many Italians are, you might leave someone a missed call to let them know that you're on the way. If you're dating somebody and you just want to let them know that you missed them, you might leave them a missed call. Which, by the way, fantastic. I wish one could manage relationships so simply. And so using this existing culture in India, he asked people to leave him a missed call. Does anyone want to guess how many people did this as an expression of support for his campaign? 1 million. Okay. Any other guesses? Okay. 35 million. 35 million Indians left Anna Hazare a missed call. And what this produced was this enormous database of people that he could re-engage as part of his national campaign in India around corruption. Oh, dear. I did this specially for you guys. So Anna Hazare was channeling new power. He mobilized a huge number of people. He turned that into a massive protest movement in India. Out of those people, he turned hundreds of thousands of people out onto the streets in Delhi. And what he was doing really was channeling the power of the emerging Indian middle class. Whether you like it or not, I mean, Beppe Grillo is another example of this new power. Here is a man who is essentially a self-described clown who, nonetheless, with no formal political apparatus and simply the power of a very intense online following, was able to mobilize very significantly, as you know, and winning the third largest share of votes in the last national elections. That's new power at work. New power is Airbnb. Airbnb is an extraordinary platform that within just a few years has become the largest provider of short-term accommodation in the world, more than any hotel group, right? And there are 15 million people now around the world who are using Airbnb. And Airbnb has built this infrastructure and a business that's now valued at $10 billion without a single square foot of real estate. And the model is entirely based on peer-to-peer coordination and mass participation. So people just very efficiently renting their apartments out to each other for these short-term stays, and the infrastructure relies on the involvement of many. What it's also done is provided a source of income to millions of additional people who are renting out these apartments. And in doing so, they're creating a new kind of economic activity that looks very different to traditional jobs. And new power is what happened on January the 18th, 2012, where a bill called SOPA PIPA, which was about copyright infringement, was about to be passed in the US Congress. And basically, the tech companies and institutions like Wikipedia and Google mobilized their new power followings to essentially stage a historic internet blackout. So this is Wikipedia, which was like, sorry, we're out of here, to protest this bill. And in doing so, they got 10 million people to contact the Congress. And what was expected to be a bill that would be easily passed, because it was backed by incumbent industries who were interested in copyright protection, publishers, the music industry, et cetera, was absolutely squashed. And it was very hastily withdrawn from the Congress. That's new power. New power is Kickstarter, which in just a few years, a little crowdfunding site has been able to eclipse the National Endowment of the Arts, the largest arts funding body in the United States, as a source of funding for arts projects. So it's generated, and let's be honest, funding the arts is a difficult challenge, has actually generated $1 billion of additional funding for creative projects. How? Through a highly decentralized model where millions of people in very small increments are funding those projects. And New Power is Avaz, an organization that I co-founded, which now has 36 million members around the world and is a rapidly deployable movement of people that can be drawn to act on major global issues. So that's New Power. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's different about New Power vis-a-vis old power and how the mechanisms work differently. Old power works like a currency. It's held in a restricted, limited supply. New power works like a current. Old power is held by a few. New power isn't held by many, it's made by many. The models that we're describing here, these new power models, are constituted by many, and their participation and coordination is what enables their scale and effectiveness. New power is an upload approach. It takes and draws its power from bottom-up participation. Old power is based on download. And old power commands, while new power leverages the power of sharing to aggregate and create these new kinds of power. So these are the structural differences that we see. And if we think about many of the models that are emerging in the world, we think that new power is posing a challenge to a lot of these incumbent structures. But let's talk more about it. What is new power not? And this is where people sometimes get mistaken. A lot of people think that the way to get new power is to, you make a Facebook page. Let me tell you, the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, he has a Facebook page. That doesn't mean he's engaged or embraced the values of mass participation and peer-to-peer coordination. New power is not inherently positive. In fact, there are certainly both functions where we want new power nowhere near. We don't want medical degrees to be crowdsourced. We don't want situations in which expertise is required to be overrun by the power of the crowd. And in fact, new power can be a new form of exploitation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Nor is new power the inevitable victor. So think about the kind of titanic struggle that's going on right now between Edward Snowden, who's a classic New Power actor, who uses these WikiLeaks-style techniques, who mobilizes a base of millions of supporters who give him moral legitimacy, and who does all of this using technology. And look at the struggle he's in with the NSA. So one guy, Snowden, using these New Power techniques, has been able to eke out quite significant reforms already from the US government on these issues. But it's by no means clear who's going to win that struggle. And in many cases, what you see are these old power incumbents striking back. So you take Airbnb, and it's now being attacked ferociously, both by regulators and by the hotels industry, who recognize what a competitive threat it is. So these are the behaviors that I think characterize New Power. And when you think about these behaviors, think about the people you know who are under 30, because they have a fundamentally different approach to engaging with society. You know, even when I grew up in the 1990s in Australia, you know, we had 5 television stations. And, you know, I watched those TV stations. The idea that I could produce my own content or that I could make my own goods for a global market seemed absolutely comic. Whereas today, if you're growing up, you have a completely different set of cultural expectations. You know, you're sharing every day on platforms like Facebook. You are shaping. So millions of young people are now content creators. You have these people who have incredible followings on YouTube who come from complete obscurity, but who millions of people follow. And I guarantee you, you haven't heard of any of them. You've got these new funding platforms where, you know, through mechanisms like Kickstarter, people today are essentially taking tasks that used to require a great deal of capital up front, and they're sort of solving for those things in a coordinated fashion. We see people being producers. So young people today are sharing and producing things on platforms like Etsy. They are in many ways constituting those things. We're going to see more of that as manufacturing gets more distributed. And at the top of the curve, you have models in which there's actually co-ownership of the platforms themselves. So, you know, you see models like Bitcoin, which I think are highly vulnerable in part because they are such radical New Power models. But they rely on kind of, you know, utter decentralized and co-owned structure. And I think as we move forward, we're going to see more of these structures, and some of them are going to get the infrastructure in order to be really quite effective. So this is what we call the New Power Compass. And what it does is it helps us to think about where organizations fit on this journey. And we plot this against sort of 2 things. One, the model. So it's possible to have a New Power model which relies on peer-to-peer coordination and mass participation. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have New Power values. New Power values are things like a belief in transparency and participation as ends in themselves, often a very informal, highly networked approach to governance. And what you see on this chart are some interesting things. One thing to note is that Apple, we actually describe as an old power company. So even though Apple, of course, deploys technology, if you think about both its values and its model, it's incredibly top-down. Apple releases these beautiful products on a very strict schedule. It really eschews the idea of open source. And it's incredibly secretive. It doesn't embrace transparency at all. By the way, that doesn't mean it's unsuccessful. It's the most valuable company in the world. So there are still ways to be incredibly effective as an old power company. And yet you see others in that quadrant that are, you know, much more vulnerable because of those models. You know, you think of the Obama example, I think it's very interesting. I think Obama, the president, was elected using New Power. He leapfrogged a much more established field through massive micro-donations, an army of volunteers that eclipsed the more top-down and traditional campaign run by Hillary Clinton. But once he governed in a pretty old power way. And that was part of why you know, there has been some disillusionment about his presidency. So what should old power do in response to some of these shifts? Well, this is something that we describe as a New Power Audit. And this is a set of questions that we think organizations need to ask themselves about their organizational structure, their business model, how they communicate, what kind of leadership they have. What you see in a lot of organizations is a kind of a digital beard. There's a person that's the chief digital officer, but they're often sort of stuck in a corner somewhere and they're wheeled out to make the organization look innovative. But frankly, there's no real shift to the underlying values or the underlying business model that enables that organization. So it's a process of thinking through, whether there's real participation either in the model or in the way the organization runs. And in a way, we urge organizations to think about occupying themselves. Imagine that you are your own harshest critic, that a group of people who are deeply skeptical about your model and about your values have camped in the heart of your organization and are asking you questions that are fundamental and structural about your model, and see what implications that has for the trajectory that you're on. But what about new power? Should new power just sort of ride into the sunset and emerge as the increasing victors? Well, actually, I think there are enormous challenges for the newly powerful. And I think the example of Uber is a very, very interesting one. So for those of you who don't know, Uber is a classic new power model. Uber has basically come in and they've taken a traditional industry, which is the taxi industry, which has been quite hierarchical and structured with these taxi and limousine commissions who create a very regulated context. And they've just upended that with a radically decentralized model. So basically they've created some software that allows anyone basically to get in a car with a little bit of training, become a driver, earn some money, and the whole thing is enabled in this very decentralized way. Now, Uber doing that is now valued at almost $20 billion by the markets. And it just raised over $1 billion in capital. The problem with this model is that as new power gives to so many people, so they've now got tens of thousands of these Uber drivers, and they've got millions of consumers, new power giveth, new power also taketh away. Because frankly, Uber's pressures now are to essentially eke out enough value that it can justify that sky-high valuation for its investors in the markets. So what it's doing is it's squeezing the people who enable that new power model, the participants. So what's begun to happen, believe it or not, is that Uber drivers have started to form unions, which is pretty amazing. This is a guy here who's begun to unionize, right? And you can see the intensity and the anger in his face, right? And this is when this model bites back. And Uber is so threatened by this, and their values are so old power, they've tried to stop their own drivers from communicating with each other. And they've described these efforts at unionization as a joke. They also price gouge their consumers, as some of you who've tried to get to JFK on a bad traffic day would know. So what does new power do to adapt to this? I think this is true of Facebook. It's true of many of these models. If you're going to prevail and build a model based on the participation of millions of people, you actually do need those people to stay engaged with you. You have to take their participation seriously. And so the broader challenge for these new power actors is many of them want to be on an island. Some of these Silicon Valley folks lately have been talking about a secessionist movement. Why don't we create this fabulous new state where all of our tech companies can prevail? We don't really need government. We don't really need public goods. And the fact is that many of these new power actors are actually just don't necessarily have a structural analysis. They're not thinking about how these models can actually make the lives of people better. They're not addressing issues and challenges like inequality. And so in a sense, in order for new power to be successful, they have to do more than just dream of 1,000 financial exits, as the Ubers of the world are doing. They have to enter civil society. And we have to use the power that these new models have to mobilize hundreds of millions and billions of people to actually contribute to solving problems that governments solve and that we need to solve as societies. And I think that's the big challenge. So to end up, when I think about new power, I think of this young woman called Bia. Bia is a young woman who started a campaign in Rio. Because as you know, in the lead up to the Olympics and the World Cup, there is an enormous amount of money flowing in and a lot of favela evictions, a lot of development that's resulting in local communities being upended. Bia's school, which was rated one of the top 10 schools in Rio and which served disadvantaged students, was about to be bulldozed to make way for an Olympic parking lot. So Bia used a platform that we created at Purpose called Mir Rio to start a campaign to save her school. And with the help of Rio, what we did was we created a webcam and a website where we said to people, we know the school is going to be demolished within a week. The only way for us to stop it is for all of us as citizens to monitor this web stream. And as soon as we see bulldozers arriving at the school, you'll receive a text message. That text message will alert you that you are a citizen guardian of the school, and you'll rush to the school to form a human barrier to protect the school. And just by doing that, of course, we got so much attention, and it was such a brave story of this young girl who launched this campaign, that the mayor of Rio said, you know what, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to close this school. And he agreed to keep the school open and to a more participatory process for future school closings. That's the person who in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, is going to be bringing her values, her intuitive understanding that as an 11-year-old girl, she can single-handedly change, civic policy in Rio. That's the person that you need to be accountable to. And so with that, I'm going to stop and allow us to have a conversation. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. I had the opportunity to listen to Jeremy's ideas at Davos a few months ago at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which some would picture as the place where all the incumbents are. So as you can imagine, this was quite the presentation to listen to at the time. Jeremy obviously is, I would say, a disruptor himself in that he has done a lot of things, actually. I want to mention in particular, when he was even younger than now, he founded an organization in Australia called Get Up. An organization recognized social movement phenomenon that has more members now than all Australia's political parties together. And founded AVAS, that he made reference to, world's largest online citizen movement with more than 35 million members. So as you see, these things can start in and I say this with a bit of cynicism, but can start in a bit of a funky way or fun way, but end up being real disruptors of well-established business and political models. So I have a couple of questions for Jeremy, because I really want to take this privilege of sitting here, because I want him to elaborate on those. A lot of the disruption is, I'm a big fan of that, because on one side it keeps people on their toes, avoid complacency, it avoids rants of position. It can have an interesting impact on society in terms of meritocracy, in terms of social mobility even. And briefly, the smarter you are in using these new technologies and these new opportunities, the more successful you can be. However, is disruption always good? That's a question for you. We looked at Uber, their interesting implications to disrupting a classical model. And the corollary to that is how, in your opinion, is nowadays important for political institutions and for businesses to be thoughtful about these new approaches, to these new models of power. In particular, on the political side, we see often in developed and developing countries a certain dilution of classical power centers. Governments seem often squeezed between international forms of power, be that the European Union or others, and more attentive citizens, more inclusive or included citizens that through new technologies, new interfaces, social media, want more, expect more, want more transparency. Nothing is secret anymore. Nothing can be hidden. There is no reverence left. How important is this? How is this really transforming the world?
Well, I think we can put there's sort of a set of normative questions, and there's just a reality. Normatively, I think new power is a mixed bag. I mean, I think there's enormous potential for new power, but new power is just as capable as producing Occupy Wall Street as it is producing the Tea Party. And I'm sure all of you would think that at least one of those was a bad thing. So the point is that I think there's a reality that we can't avoid. In terms of how these models are going to emerge, I mean, I think to me the big question is, internet connectivity enables these made-by-many models. They will systematically, in sector after sector, education, media, etc., emerge as challenges to these top-down models. There's no doubt about that. The question is, as they do that, do they just become another reflection of old power, right? Which is really the Uber example. Do they just become the new elites? And in doing so, does nothing much change? Or does power get fundamentally distributed so that more people hold that power? Do the Uber drivers in their unionization efforts end up with enough power that you actually have this new segment of people who are empowered by a new economy? Or in the end, do all the spoils and all the value go to Uber off the backs of these more participatory models? And I think this is really an open question.
Thanks, Jeremy. Are there questions from, I see one down there.
Hi, my name is Ippolita. I love what you're doing. And one of the things that I always ask myself, is there a strategy for identifying what call to actions actually precipitate mass participation? Because, for example, in the last couple of years, I've been involved in a couple of different initiatives, one around gun control. And, from my point of view, I was trying to think of what I could possibly do, because a lot of people just throw up their hands saying, oh my God, the issue is too big, I can't deal with the NRA, I can't deal with the regulation, et cetera. But I was thinking, yes, but you actually can do something personally. So if every single person actually took responsibility and said, okay, I can't govern other people's behavior, but I can govern my own, then, if you could just get that message out, then you possibly could create a huge change worldwide, let's say. So, but not every call to action, actually creates change. So is there a strategy for identifying how to communicate that formula?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what the organization that I run, Purpose, does. And gun violence is a great example. So we just launched a $50 million organization that's led by Michael Bloomberg called Everytown, which is a movement around gun violence. And the lesson on gun violence is very interesting because the NRA actually it may have very old power values, but it has a new power model. It has 3 or 4 million members in the United States who are passionate believers in gun rights. And they are the crowdfunding engine of that organization. They raise $100 million a year in member dues. So that's an organization that's genuinely grassroots. And the way that we're going to transform that issue is if we can build a genuine grassroots movement on the other side. And that's a long-term project, especially in this country, where there's such a tradition of gun ownership and a belief in guns as a cultural kind of artifact. And so in order to do that, what we're doing is we're helping to organize mums around the country, because we know that mums are really powerful moral voices on this issue. Mums who are terrified when their kids are now going to sort of schools and universities, and we're helping to turn them into political power, because we know that politicians listen to that voting bloc, particularly suburban mums, and so we're trying to kind of essentially match the grassroots power of the NRA with the grassroots power of people on the other side.
All of this is fascinating, but having the control of the microphone is all power. There is a soccer game on. New power tends to look for much more. Quite fascinated by your presentation. I would take new power over old power. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alberto. So I'm aware that we are standing between the soccer game, so we'll wrap it up.